There has always been a conversation around Shane Eagle. In recent times, Shane has occupied a strange space in South African hip-hop. Unlike many of his peers, he hasn't played the industry's game in the traditional sense. He disappears for months, even years at a time, only to return when he feels like he has something worth saying. Naturally, that approach has fueled a different conversation. For years, fans have debated whether Shane Eagle, for the lack of a better term, has fallen off. Those conversations grew even louder following the release of Akira, with many questioning whether he still belonged in the big three conversation with artists like Nasty C and A-Reece. To a lot of listeners, nothing he's released since his SAMA award-winning debut album Yellow has managed to capture the same impact or acclaim. But I think that conversation misses something far more interesting. Because if you follow Shane Eagle's music closely, you'll notice that his career hasn't simply been a story of popularity decline. It's been a story of personal transformation. Across the years, his music has gradually shifted away from the familiar themes of flexing, hedonism, and proving himself, making room for ideas of faith, healing, grief, fatherhood, and purpose. That evolution reaches its clearest expression on his latest album, Never Meet Your Heroes, which is filled with songs like Choose God and Son of Yahweh, where spirituality is no longer a subtle undercurrent but the foundation of the project itself. And that's what makes Shane Eagle such a fascinating artist to talk about. Hip-hop has always celebrated authenticity, keeping it real. We praise artists for staying true to themselves and making the music they genuinely believe in. But what happens when staying true to yourself takes you further away from the sound and image that made people fall in love with you in the first place? What happens when that same authenticity costs you commercial success? Today, I want to explore the artistic evolution of Shane Eagle, how Christianity in particular gradually found its way to the center of his music, and whether what many people call a fall-off is actually the inevitable consequence of an artist choosing personal and spiritual growth over popularity. Fair warning, this video essay will delve into themes of religion and Christianity because it is a focal topic in Shane Eagle's music and helps us understand his evolution as an artist. We all know the story of Shane Eagle's come up, so honestly, it's not worth repeating in depth. In 2015, he appeared as a contestant on the first season of The Hustle, ultimately finishing 4th. Despite not winning the competition, it's hard to argue that anyone else emerged from that show with the same level of longevity and relevance. Because of his image and aura, Shane was almost immediately placed into the box of a commercial rapper who probably would have had some cute club joints here and there, but probably lacked artistic depth. It's something I still remember from The Hustle itself. There's an episode of The Hustle, which unfortunately I couldn't find the footage of, where guest judge Proverb warns Shane against relying on the typical rap cliches of money, women, and material success, arguing that those themes wouldn't sustain a lasting career. The irony is that Shane Eagle hadn't even established that as his artistic identity yet. Before he released a single outside the competition, people had already begun projecting onto him the kind of rapper they expected him to become. Following The Hustle, JR quickly recognized Shane's potential and signed him to Feel Good Music. It was a short-lived relationship, but this is where he released his debut single, Way Up, featuring the show's eventual winner, Big Star Johnson. On the surface, Way Up seemed to confirm everyone's assumptions. It was a booming trap anthem built around the familiar language of modern hip-hop: money, woman, luxury. Whether that reflected the music Shane genuinely wanted to make or simply the lane that made the most sense for a young artist trying to establish himself was impossible to know at the time. But looking back now, Way Up feels like the setup for what came next, because Shane's next single, Cutting Corners, was a complete 180 from the artist we'd just been introduced to. Gone were the booming trap anthems and larger-than-life braggadocio. In their place was a deeply introspective record that peeled back the layers, giving listeners a glimpse into Shane Hughes as a person rather than Shane Eagle, the rapper. More importantly, Cutting Corners plants the seeds for the artist Shane would eventually become. Throughout the song, he weaves spirituality into personal storytelling. One of the most striking lines comes when he raps, "When you pack your gun, don't forget to pack your Bible too." It's a lyric that suggests that even when life forces you into dangerous environments, you shouldn't forget your moral compass. He reinforces that idea from the beginning of the song, opening with the line, "I've been living life on faith." Whether you interpret that as his trust in God or simply choosing to move forward without certainty, it introduces a theme that would become increasingly central throughout his music, navigating life's uncertainties with hope rather than control. The song also reveals a level of vulnerability that stood in stark contrast to the image many had already formed of him. Shane talks about his sister's struggles with lines like, "I seen her popping pills to make the pain go away," before following it with the haunting lyric, "She's staring at the rope to make the blame go away." Here, he quietly talks about his sister's battle with addiction and suicidal ideation, using those moments to remind listeners that pain doesn't disappear simply because success arrives. Ironically, after releasing one of the most personal songs of his career, Shane would spend the rest of 2016 riding the wave of trap's commercial explosion, dropping records that embraced the club-ready sound dominating South African hip-hop at the time. That same year, he managed to scoop up a spot as a presenter on V Entertainment alongside DJ Speedster, Lala Hiriyama, and Moozley. On DJ Slick's Oceans featuring The Les, Shane sounds every bit like the rap star South Africa had been waiting for. He raps, "I parked the whip, I got the bikes out, but check my neck, I got it iced out. I remember days when we was dead broke, we used to walk nigga, we catch flights now." And this is important because it captures the version of Shane that was beginning to emerge in the mainstream consciousness, one defined by success and mass appeal. In fact, much of those early records is what made me a fan of Shane Eagle in the first place. By 2017, Shane would fully step into the spotlight with his critically acclaimed debut album, Yellow. Released under his own imprint, Eagle Entertainment, the project is a carefully constructed meditation on childhood memories, his future aspirations, and the state of South African hip-hop at the time. But beneath all that, Yellow also reveals something more introspective. In the opening lines of Strange, Shane Eagle raps, "I look up north when I pray to the skies. It's funny when things go south, God never replies. Is he testing me? Is he blessing me?" Yeah, Shane doesn't reject faith, but rather he just wrestles with it. He questions whether hardship is a form of being tested or a hidden blessing. This tension is crucial because it shows that even at the height of his early success, Shane was already engaging with deeper spiritual uncertainty. The album's most vulnerable moment arrives halfway through with the song Aliens, Conversations with God. While Strange hinted at Shane's spiritual curiosity, Aliens, Conversations with God puts it front and center. Rather than speaking about God from a distance, Shane speaks directly to him. What's striking is that he never questions God's existence, he questions his methods. Why does suffering exist? Why does God seem silent? Why does faith sometimes feel so uncertain? They're uncomfortable questions, but they're also deeply human questions. In many ways, this is the first time we hear Shane wrestling with not only faith, but religion itself. On Aliens, the first half of the song, he raps, "Used to be a Christian boy on a mission, always told never question religion." It's a revealing line because it suggests that spirituality had always been a part of his life, but the environment he grew up in left little room for curiosity or doubt. Shane seems to be pushing back against the idea that faith should never be questioned. Funny enough though, the questioning becomes the very thing that deepens his search for God. That idea becomes even clearer in the second half of the song where he raps, "You gave me my mind, I use it to think. I'm right on the brink. Religion is nothing but chaining my people. I feel like I'm missing the link." Shane doesn't appear to be dismissing faith itself. Instead, he's drawing a distinction between religion as an institution and a personal relationship with God. The lyric echoes a sentiment shared by many believers that religion can sometimes become more concerned with rules, tradition, control than the genuine spiritual transformation. He closes the thought with one of the strongest metaphors in his catalog. Who does the captain talk to when you feel like the ship is gonna sink? The captain is the person everyone depends on. They're expected to remain composed while everyone else looks to them for direction. But who carries the captain's burdens? Who does the person holding everything together turn to when they themselves begin to fall apart? Within the context of the song, Shane's answer is God. It's a strong metaphor because even the person steering the ship eventually reaches a point where they need someone greater than themselves to guide them through the storm. This recurring engagement with faith so early in his career helps us understand that Shane Eagle was never just chasing the fame. Even within a commercially successful debut, he was already building the foundation of an artist defined by vulnerability as by rap success. By the end of the Yellow era, Shane Eagle had seemingly reached the summit. His debut album had earned widespread critical acclaim, culminating in a South African Music Award for Best Hip Hop Album in 2018. He secured a partnership with fashion brand A-Reece, announced the nationwide Yellow Tour, appeared alongside A-Reece and Nasty C in the 2018 BET Africa Cypher, solidifying the trio as the new generation of South African rap, and even landed a feature from Dreamville rapper Bars on Apex. On paper, Shane Eagle was living the dream every young rapper imagines. But life has a way of reminding us that success doesn't exempt anyone from suffering. While touring Europe with Bars on the European leg of the Milky Way tour, Shane received the news that his father had passed away. It's difficult to imagine the emotional conflict of the moment. Here he was, sharing stages across Europe with one of his musical peers, experiencing what should have been one of the defining highlights of his career, only to have it interrupted by unimaginable loss. Despite the devastation, Shane made the difficult decision to complete the tour before returning home to South Africa. Although his father had reportedly been in poor health, no amount of preparation can lessen the weight of losing a parent. Success suddenly becomes secondary. The accolades and tours and all of the industry recognition no longer carries the same meaning when measured against personal grief. And it's here that I believe we begin to understand the next chapter of Shane Eagle's artistry. Out of that grief came Dark Moonflower. Yellow was this album bathed in sunlight, full of youthful ambition, while DMF is what happens when that sun goes down. It's easily his most important project up to that point, using music as a form of catharsis. Throughout the album, Shane opens up about his mental health, mortality, and the lingering pain of losing a loved one, while continuing to deepen the spiritual conversations that had quietly existed in his music since Cutting Corners. Now, I've already dedicated an entire video to breaking down Dark Moonflower, so I won't spend too much time analyzing the project here. What matters for this conversation is what the album represents. It marks the point where that spirituality is no longer just one of Shane Eagle's recurring themes. It becomes one of the primary lenses through which he begins to understand both his music and his life. The project opens up with Black, and from the very first lines, it's clear that something has changed. Yeah, I talked to God at the crib. I don't really like to go to church. It's an eye-catching way to begin the album because it echoes the question Shane first raised on Yellow. On Conversations with God, he reflected on growing up in an environment where questioning religion wasn't encouraged. Here, that tension seems to evolve into a more personal expression of faith. Shane appears to place greater emphasis on a personal relationship with God than on the institution of church itself. That idea resurfaces later on the album with the song XXX, where he declares, "You ain't gotta go to church, I'm living proof that God's alive." Now, whether or not the listener agrees with that perspective, it reveals something very consistent in Shane Eagle's writing. The spiritual questions that once sounded uncertain on Yellow are beginning to develop into a more defined personal worldview. But the evolution isn't only spiritual, it's personal. On Black, Shane also raps, "Rappers want me for their songs, can't even get me for the interview." On the surface, it's an industry bar, but within the context of Shane's career, it represents something much bigger. This is an artist deliberately stepping away from the constant demand for visibility. He's no longer chasing every feature, chasing every interview, or every opportunity to remain in the public eye. That mindset echoes throughout the album. I hope you save your pennies for when shit get cold. Fake bitches, fast money ain't around no more. Fake friends never stood the test of time at all. Probably could have spent that time with your family at home. This is the sound of a man who doesn't find fame all that appealing anymore. One of the clearest effects of loss or hitting those emotional lows is that people begin to see others more clearly for who they really are. In Shane's case, there's a growing awareness that many of the relationships built around success were conditional. People who were present only when there was something to gain. In an industry as fickle as music, those connections often disappear the moment those benefits dry up. Rather than lashing out, Shane seems to be stepping back and reassessing what actually holds more value in his life. The mention of family in particular signals a course correction toward what is stable and lasting, in contrast to the temporary nature of fame, money, and industry relationships. This becomes even clearer on June, where Shane brings the project's ideas full circle by referencing one of his earlier career moments on Way Up. I started with look at my wrist, but money don't make you rich. The juxtaposition between those two ideas are significant. His debut single, Way Up, centered around material status and success, which reflects a younger version of Shane who is still navigating the excitement and validation that came with fame. In June, however, that same symbol of wealth is reinterpreted with distance and simplicity. The emphasis is no longer on what he has accumulated, but on what those things fail to provide. His follow-up albums, Green and Akira, would continue to expand on those themes of healing and self-growth, and even double down on making the music he wants to make, with Shane himself mentioning that the album Green would function as a sort of a reset. But the transformation wouldn't just be in the content, but the music itself. His later output would be categorized almost as a step away from the formulaic trap production and see him experiment with more soulful production, lo-fi textures, slow jazzy tempos, and borderline boom bap rap. Consequently, this non-commercial approach would be jarring and alienate a bigger audience, thus transitioning Shane into more of a niche artist. I remember this clearly because even I was kind of put off on the majority of songs from Green and Akira just based on this sonic soundscape alone. This is not to say that he completely abandoned the hi-hats and 808s. I mean, Akira had a song produced by international producer Jalil Beats, showing that Shane hadn't entirely abandoned modern rap aesthetics. However, in the 2020s, as artists like Blackie, Usama Mane, Jay Katana, Brother Cooper, and even Nasty C increasingly embraced the crossover potential of genres like Afrobeats, melodic rap, and more recently Amapiano and even Gqom influences, Shane continued traveling in almost the opposite direction. So everything we've discussed ultimately leads to Never Meet Your Heroes. In many ways, it feels like the destination Shane Eagle had been moving toward all along. Shane himself has said he needed to make albums like Dark Moonflower, Green and Akira before he could create Never Meet Your Heroes. Looking back across his discography, that statement makes perfect sense. Those projects were sort of stepping stones. Each one stripped away another layer of the artist the world expected Shane Eagle to be, bringing us closer to the man behind the music. Released after a 2-year hiatus, during which Shane also became a father, Never Meet Your Heroes arrived with almost no traditional rollout or lead singles. It was another reminder that, for better or worse, Shane has always preferred to move on his own terms rather than according to the industry's playbook. The themes of the album weren't entirely new either. Faith, healing, self-reflection have existed in Shane's music. The difference is the posture from which he now speaks. Earlier in his career, Shane often sounded like a man searching, questioning God, wrestling with religion, and even trying to make sense of suffering. On Never Meet Your Heroes, that uncertainty has largely given way to conviction. His faith no longer feels like a question he's asking, it feels like the foundation from which he's living. The maturity is evident throughout the album. On Ride Out, Shane reasserts his place within South African hip-hop while reflecting on one of the deepest regrets of his life. Still remember my father's last teardrop before I hopped on a plane to Europe. Should have stayed my ass in Africa, I would have been a foot up. This is a heartbreaking admission because it shows that grief doesn't just disappear with time. Even years later, the pain still remains, and so does the instinct to wonder what could have been done differently. If there was ever an explicit acknowledgement of Shane turning his back on the industry's expectations, it comes on Let There Be Light, where he raps, "Remember when you chose your heart over choosing fame? That was the greatest decision you could have ever made. Took the road less traveled, took you far. Without the chains, diamond rings, you still a star." Early in his career, success was often measured through accomplishments, recognition, and the approval that came with it. Here, Shane seems to rethink what success actually means. The chains and diamond rings no longer represent the things he needs to prove his worth. And it raises an even more personal question. When you strip away the recognition and everything you've accumulated, are you happy with the person you see in the mirror? Because if the answer is yes, perhaps that's a form of wealth that no amount of money can buy. If there was one song that captures the destination of Shane's journey though, it's Arrival. The title itself feels fitting. After years of questioning and grieving, he has finally arrived. The uncertainty that peppered songs throughout his debut album has been replaced by confidence. One lyric in particular stands out. Heard him say it gets better after it gets worse. Damn, I seen my sister in a hearse the same year I seen my girl give birth. Years earlier, on Cutting Corners, Shane gave us small glimpses into his sister's struggles with addiction and suicidal thoughts. Here, he reveals the devastating conclusion to that story. And in the very same breath, he tells us about becoming a father. So we see how death and life sort of collide. Grief and hope exist side by side. The album's core message reaches its clearest expression on Choose God. Throughout Shane's career, faith has often been something he meditated on. However, on Choose God, it becomes something he actively practices. Midway through the song, he pauses the music to actually lead a prayer. That's rare in mainstream SA rap. Whether listeners share his beliefs or not, it's difficult to imagine the Shane Eagle of Way Up or Top Floor making a song like this. By this point, the Christian themes are so central to Never Meet Your Heroes that it's actually fair to ask whether the album belongs in the conversation as a Christian rap record. So now, this brings me to another question. Can an artist make music this openly shaped by Christian faith and still strive within South African hip-hop? At first glance, the two seem almost incompatible. Mainstream hip-hop has traditionally rewarded confidence, ambition, and larger-than-life personalities. The biggest records are often built around status, wealth, nightlife, sex, success, and the idea of having made it. That's not to say hip-hop can't be introspective or spiritual. It absolutely can. We've seen examples of those. But those themes have historically occupied a much smaller space than the music that dominates radio stations, clubs, and playlists. This was especially true during the commercial peak of South African hip-hop between 2014 and 2016. This was the era of club anthems, crossover singles, radio-friendly records. Artists weren't just competing to have the best verse, they were competing to have the biggest hit. The sound was polished and accessible, helping South African hip-hop reach audiences it had never reached before. Even Shane Eagle's own breakout records fit comfortably within that landscape, which is why his artistic evolution feels so unusual. Instead of moving further towards the mainstream, he gradually walked away from it. What's interesting is that Shane isn't the only South African rapper to publicly embrace Christianity. Casper Nyovest, one of the country's biggest hip-hop artists, has spoken openly about becoming a born-again Christian. In 2023, he released Solomon, describing the album as his spiritual rebirth and his attempt to reconcile faith with the life he previously lived. But listening to Solomon, I came away with a different impression than I did from Never Meet Your Heroes. Where Shane's faith becomes the framework through which he writes his music, Casper often sounds like an artist still working out how those convictions fit within the identity that made him one of South Africa's biggest stars. The album moves between moments of spiritual reflection and the familiar themes of commercial rap, creating a tension that feels intentional but at times unresolved. That's not necessarily a criticism. I myself like the album. In fact, it may reflect a bigger challenge faced by artists who undergo a profound personal transformation after they've already built a career around a particular image. Completely abandoning the formula that brought millions of listeners to your music is an enormous creative and commercial risk. Fans expect familiarity. The industry rewards consistency, and the moment an artist changes too dramatically, the conversation often switches from "this is different" to "they've fallen off." Shane Eagle appears to have accepted that risk. Rather than trying to balance two identities, he increasingly allowed his faith and grief and his personal growth to reshape not only what he rapped about, but how he made music in the first place. Another artist who raises this question, funny enough, is J Molly. Unlike Shane Eagle, whose spiritual journey unfolded gradually across multiple projects, J Molly's turning point came very publicly. Following a suicide attempt and periods in and out of rehab, he announced that he had accepted Jesus Christ into his life and intended intended to leave secular music behind in favor of making gospel music. As of now, we haven't really heard what that next chapter sounds like. If and when J Molle returns, he'll be faced with many of the same creative questions that artists like Shane Eagle have had to wrestle with. How do you remain true to a genuine spiritual transformation without losing the artistic identity your audience first connected with? How do you write openly about faith without sounding performative or preachy? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how much of the artist you once were do you leave behind? Those aren't easy questions, especially in a genre where image is everything and audiences often expect consistency as stated. A dramatic shift in subject matter can be read as growth by some listeners and alienation by others. In that sense, J Molle's next release, whenever it arrives, could become one of the most interesting case studies in South African hip-hop. Not because it tells us whether Christian rap can succeed commercially, but because it reveals what happens when an artist tries to reconcile profound personal change with the expectations of an audience that first fell in love with a very different version of them. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Did Shane Eagle actually fall off? If we measure him purely by commercial success, then it's difficult to argue that he's operating at the same level he was during the Yellow era. Just a few years ago, Shane was opening for J. Cole, touring Europe with Dreamville, collecting industry awards, and widely being spoken about as 1/3 of South Africa's new Big Three. By almost every metric, that was the peak of his career. But careers rarely decline because of a single decision. One factor that deserves mentioning is the departure of Von Thiel, Shane's longtime business partner at Eagle Entertainment. During the Yellow era, Von played a significant role in the business side of Shane Eagle's career, helping him build relationships within the industry and overseeing many of the opportunities that accompanied Shane's rise. As time went on, however, the demands of running a label built around a single artist became increasingly limiting. Eventually, Von left Eagle Entertainment to pursue an executive role at Stay Low, an independent label operating under Stain Entertainment. That departure coincided with a noticeable change in how Shane Eagle approached his career. Rather than leaning into the traditional machinery of the music industry, Shane increasingly adopted a DIY approach. Albums arrived with little fanfare, minimal promotional campaigns, and almost no conventional rollout. It was a creative decision that aligned with the independent path he'd been paving for years, but it also meant sacrificing many of the advantages that come with sustained marketing and industry visibility. The long gaps between releases only amplified that challenge. There was a lengthy silence between Dark Moonflower and Green, followed by another between Akira and Never Meet Your Heroes. In today's streaming era, where artists are expected to remain constantly visible, disappearing for years at a time almost inevitably comes at a commercial cost. Then, there's the music itself. As we've discussed throughout this video, Shane's sound gradually shifted away from the trap records that first introduced him to mainstream audiences. His production became slower, more soulful, and increasingly introspective. A big part of this was the split with his longtime producer Shooter Coombs. Shooter Coombs would leave alongside Von and become the in-house producer for Stay Low. This meant that the producer who produced the majority of Yellow and anchoring DMF was no longer around to give his input on the sound Shane was chasing. As a result, his writing became more introspective. His subject matter became more personal and eventually more overtly spiritual. For some listeners, that evolution represented artistic growth. For others, it simply wasn't the Shane Eagle they had originally connected with. The numbers reflect that reality. Yellow was supported by a nationwide tour, a short film, and a traditional promotional campaign. Never Meet Your Heroes, by contrast, arrived with virtually no rollout and relatively little post-release promotion, despite being, in my opinion, one of the strongest and most cohesive projects of Shane's career. Another criticism often leveled at Shane Eagle was his decision to join the cast of Love and Hip Hop South Africa in 2023. For many fans, the move felt like a departure from the image they had built of him. Shane had cultivated a reputation as a thoughtful, almost elusive artist, so appearing on a reality television show was seen by some as a loss of order and not the direction they envisioned for his career. At the same time, it's worth remembering that television has always been a part of Shane's story. His career career was launched on the reality competition The Hustle, and before Yellow turned him into one of South Africa's most celebrated rappers, he was also a presenter on V Entertainment. In that sense, Love and Hip Hop South Africa wasn't a complete departure from the artist Shane had always been. It was another appearance in a medium he'd navigated since the very beginning of his career. Whether the move ultimately helped or hurt his public image, that's open for debate, but it does highlight the tension that has followed Shane throughout his career. Fans often celebrate authenticity, yet they also build expectations around what that authenticity is supposed to look like. So, did Shane Eagle fall off? Commercially, it's fair to say he no longer occupies the same position he once did. Artistically, I'm not convinced that's the right question. Because when you listen to Shane's discography from beginning to end, one thing becomes clear. He didn't wake up one day and decide to become a different artist. The seeds were always there. They were there on Cutting Corners, they were there on Yellow, they grew through grief on Dark Moonflower, they took shape on Green and Akira, and they finally bloomed on Never Meet Your Heroes. We often tell artists to stay true to themselves, but what happens when staying true means becoming someone your audience never asked for? Shane Eagle may never match the commercial heights of Yellow again, but if his music is an honest reflection on who he's become, perhaps that's not a fall off. Perhaps it's just a different definition of success.